This video is brought to you by Aldara. If you search Games Workshop 3D printing on YouTube, this is the kind of video you would find. Simply lovely, right? It appears that according to certain channels on YouTube, Games Workshop current life expectancy is somewhere shorter than Grandma Lucille's. All thanks to 3D printing apparently. But the real question, is this actually happening? Does 3D printing spell eternal doom for Games Workshop and smaller miniature and terrain companies? Or is this just a really clickbaity topic that isn't actually true? Maybe a bit of both. Well, that's what we're going to explore in today's video. And in order to answer these complicated questions, I decided to do more than just internet detective work. So I went to one of the largest wargaming conventions in the country, Adepticon, to see for myself what kind of an impact 3D printing was really having on the wargaming world. I talked to actual tournament players, game store owners, and saw firsthand 3D printing competing with the biggest wargaming company in the world. And all of this combined will hopefully help us answer the question, is 3D printing actually killing tabletop gaming? I actually covered this video topic in 2018, 4 years ago at PAX Unplugged, but the current 3D printing world is about as different as Will Ferrell's performance in Anchorman vs. Talladega Nights. Glorious, but still different. So much has happened since then. The 3D printing space has grown incredibly over the past 4 years. We now have affordable mono-screen 2K, 4K, and 8K resin printers. Entry-level priced FDM printers now come with auto bed leveling and glass beds. I've also learned how to white balance footage since then as well. There are also now over 200 miniature and terrain designers offering monthly subscription bundles, along with a viable alternative to Patreon, Tribes, on My Mini Factoring. This kind of variety in options means you can even have your very own lightly clothed, uncensored Space Elf proxies with Green Goblin flyers and all today in 2022. We've come so far. So with all this in mind, surely 3D printing is having a real impact on tabletop gaming bottom lines, right? Well, first we need to talk about adoption, which in simple terms is how many people are buying 3D printers and using them for tabletop gaming. In my first 3D Printing Weekly Sometime video, I brought up how the adoption of 3D printing tech would be one of the biggest barriers to 3D printing becoming a real threat. And I stand by that claim. So, it was interesting for me to hear Ian, owner of Golden Rhino Games in Ann Arbor, Michigan, talk about his own experience with 3D printers for himself and the store.
I actually own 2 resin 3D printers, and I have yet to have time to fire them up. I have a couple of friends that have been super enthusiastic into it, and actually one of my coworkers, Leslie, she's been fantastic at teaching me how to set different settings and using things like, I'm going to say it wrong. It's a website so that you can get all your supports. It's like Shit2Box or something like that.
Ian, I just want to confirm, Shit2Box? It is Shit2Box. We'll go back to Ian's experience as a game store owner dealing with 3D printing later. But an important follow-up question is, are Warhammer players, the ones at actual Warhammer events, i.e. outside of the YouTube comment section, actually buying and using 3D printers for their games? Well, including Ian, 4 out of the 6 players I talked to own 3D printers, and the other 2 had friends who were actively 3D printing for their local gaming scene. I'm sure it's one of those situations where they go to a dark corner of the game store and it's like, hey man, you got the goods? What goods? And believe me, I'm aware that a sample size of 6 isn't exactly indicative of mass adoption, but I thought this was pretty interesting. 6 random unrelated people attending a convention, traveling across the country to participate in official play. People who spent hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars on official models, not even including the cost of hobby supplies, paint, basic materials, storage, transportation. So then the follow-up question is, yeah, but how are they using 3D printing? And this is a very fair question. It's a common response to hear that 3D printing terrain is okay, but 3D printing proxies? We don't talk about proxies. No. But bits and conversions, on the other hand, well, those are permitted by Games Workshop from their own model requirements for events at Warhammer World. Much like hand-sculpted detail, if you've gone to the effort of designing and printing your own bespoke parts for your army, then these parts are indeed permitted at our events. Now meet Emery and Walter, 2 Warcry narrative players.
I use it for bits and conversion all the time, and I get lots of my D&D miniatures or role-playing games to use those.
About the same, mostly for D&D and bits for doing stuff like more warp smiths and stuff like that. Got to give them extra tendrils and stuff.
So maybe the idea that everyone with 3D printers is 3D printing proxies isn't accurate. Sorry, YouTube. But then again, we have folks like Paul from Fort Wayne, Indiana.
I don't have a 3D printer, but I have a lot of guys in my local scene who do it, and we have both. And so we do lots of either models or objective tokens or terrain.
So some active players are using 3D printing exactly as UW intended, i.e. for kit bashing and customizing full GW kits. And others are not only using it for their own play, but using it for their local gaming scenes, including proxies. And in Paul's own words,
Yeah, so we do all of it locally, and it's really helpful for our scene.
yeah. So it isn't always devastating to local communities. Sometimes it can be beneficial. There you go. Before we move on to terrain, I'd like to talk about today's sponsor, Aldara. Now, welcome to Aldara, a fast-paced 4X combat-focused strategy game, which includes 152 finely detailed miniatures, with which you'll vanquish other factions, explore map tiles, collect resources, and complete secondary objectives to cement your win. This game is perfect for those of you who want crunchy, fast-paced combat, as well as tons of replayability with those unique faction playstyles and randomized maps each game, making exploration really exciting. Aldara's 4 factions each play differently and come with their own themed set of 38 miniatures for each faction, bringing the total to a whopping 152 minis in this game. Aside from the awesome gameplay, the amount of stuff Kickstarter backers get is amazing and is an incredible deal with Kickstarter exclusives that are available as well. If you're a 3D printer and want to print the minis for yourself, there's even a pledge level for you too. And I can confirm, they print beautifully. So go ahead, visit the Kickstarter page using the link below to learn more and become the latest backer of Aldara today. Thanks again for sponsoring content creators Arcane Minis. Now, back to terrain. Lots of folks are okay with 3D printing terrain, right? Apparently, yes. Yes, they are. Walking the show floor of Adepticon, I was surprised to see actual 3D printed terrain being sold right there on the floor. I felt a bit like Link opening up a chest, finding something I honestly didn't expect. This company, Lasercraft Workshop, had commercial licenses to sell buildings and scatter terrain from various STL companies, so they did. Beautiful packaging and all, including important details like layer height. I thought this was really interesting because it meant that there was obviously demand for 3D printed products. All of the talk online about how ugly layer heights were in 2018 might still be the case for some, but is definitely less so in 2022. Maybe it's that sweeping change I mentioned earlier, the combination of better 3D printers, better models, perhaps adjusted community standards that have all merged to shift the community's feelings on 3D printed terrain. And while I can't be sure the exact amount Lasercraft made, they've been around since 2016, so I'm inclined to believe they know what they're doing, and there's certainly demand warranting product this amount of printing of products ahead of time for a convention like Adepticon. Now that's at the convention, but what about local game stores? Remember Ian, owner of Golden Rhino Games? Here's what he had to say about using 3D printed terrain in his own store.
So in May, my store is promoting Star Wars Month, not just the day. So we're doing a lot of Star Wars themed things. And so Leslie is actually 3D printing us terrain for the tables. We've got 7 6-foot tables and she's trying to print and make thematic ones. It looks great so far.
It was really cool for me to hear Ian, someone who sells non-printed terrain in their store, bring up how this terrain added a thematic element to their local games. This is obviously one of the strengths that 3D printing brings to the table, its ability to customize and make games your own, even outside of official bits and printed parts. This is the kind of nuance that is often left out of the arguments while people focus on how 3D printing is so dangerous to big game companies, when in reality, it can actually be enhancing and get people more excited about those games. Maybe this is the reason why pretty much every Star Wars Legion table I saw at Adepticon had 3D printed terrain. In all of those cases, the entire table was 3D printed. Now granted, I definitely couldn't see the entire floor, but I did look at one entire side of the floor room. And it wasn't just Ian or those Star Wars Legion game hosts popping out the Legion terrain. Meet Joe.
I've printed probably 15 entire Star Wars Legion tables throughout the last few years. So very familiar with that. Yeah.
15 Legion tables. It's probably more than my 2 local game stores have combined. Joe, if you're watching this, you're a beast and a legend, my man. Now, one common thread I noticed in these interviews was the general acceptance of 3D printing for games outside of the 40K and Sigmar ecosystem. Those players who played games like Star Wars Legion and even Lord of the Rings tended to be more sympathetic to 3D printing even proxies. Joe, who told me that he was very pro-print, also brought up something that I do think is often missing from this conversation.
Just as much as 3D printing is an issue, there's also a lot of people that are bootlegging and recasting. So those things exist, and I think they're just kind of just a part of the hobby that you need to accept.
Recasting in these situations is much harder to spot and less prone to that same level of customization and engagement that 3D printing provides. It's literally just a cheaper version of the same models. One example of this kind of engagement that 3D printing provides that is missing from recasts come from another Joe from Minneapolis.
Opens up the artistic aspect of it, lets people kind of do whatever they want. If there's sculpting, like either as a sculptor or just promoting like other sculptors and just having more interesting things to look at, right? More updated models, newer models, just promoting different artists, that kind of thing.
Maybe Joe's touching on something that we haven't heard yet. That 3D printing could be viewed as a form of art that just intersects with the game community that often rejects it. One common link between all of these tournament and narrative players, none of these folks felt that 3D printing was about sticking it to GW, and it was not about the vendetta you'd assume based on those reactionary YouTube videos I shared earlier. I won't say that price wasn't mentioned, but it was only mentioned once by Paul, and listen to his tone.
I honestly think it's one of those things that really makes accessibility to a lot of players because it's expensive. Like, these hobbies can be really expensive. And so to be able to get armies or even just like cool alternate sculpts of stuff or models to make your army, you know, kind of flushed out and look a little bit better, I'm all for it.
Even when being open about 3D printing proxies and things of the sort, his focus is on accessibility, and he admits that the hobby is expensive, but his response is really about engaging with the hobby in more ways, allowing more players to play a game that him and his community are passionate about. But it isn't just in these interviews where we can see this level of enthusiasm and engagement brought about by 3D printing. You can find that here on YouTube with channels like Tabletop Time, who have an entire video series about customizing and making their own faction, the Astra Primursa, with 3D printing.
Almost a year ago, I released a video revealing my final design for my custom 40k chapter, the Space Bears, or the Astra Primursa.
When it comes to these questions of whether 3D printing will kill tabletop gaming or is killing it, tone, nuance, and intent matters. Even Ian, the one game store owner interviewed, acknowledged that 3D printing was a thing and something that he would have to accept.
If you're gonna go to a store, you're gonna play and take up their space and utilize it, right? Then support them, right? I am a friendly tabletop hobby miniature store, and I want to see everybody able to have a place that they can come in and enjoy. And if they want to 3D print some cool bits or have some like off-standard models, because it's another form of art at the end of the day. All I ask is that you know that you are doing that and you need to support the store. And with that profit, it keeps the lights on and pays for employees and things like that.
Perhaps it's time to really acknowledge that the people most impacted by 3D printing are not even at this convention. They're in your hometown. It's our local friendly game stores. And if you're going to tout the impact that 3D printing will have on wargaming, it's not just going to be Games Workshop who will get hurt. It may very well be the local communities you care deeply about. And it seems that this is where we find ourselves today, experiencing the rapid growth of 3D printing, where 3D printers really are more prevalent than ever. And yet Games Workshop and other large tabletop companies have survived countless recessions, hundreds of recasting threats, 3D printed lookalikes, copyright battles with third-party company bits that were much smaller than them, and more I'm probably missing. If 3D printing is killing tabletop gaming, it's either in the form of slow-acting poison, or maybe it's like alcohol, the poison that actually makes every party more enjoyable for a lot of folks at least. And just like alcohol, 3D printing can be addicting. So be careful and considerate of the places, the hubs where your tabletop games thrive in those local community game stores, which need your support, even if 3D printing is your art style of choice to engage with your gaming community and with the games that you love. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, go ahead and subscribe and share this video with someone you think might also enjoy it. Consider becoming a patron of our Patreon as well. It really helps the channel. I'll see you next time. Happy printing and happy gaming.